Late one night, as the lights of Sunrise Bakery flickered dimly in the distance, the CEO, David Carter, sat in his car, staring at the place that had once been his dream. Whispers of abuse, stolen ingredients, and mistreated employees had reached his ears, but he couldn't trust reports anymore. Disguised as a struggling baker, he stepped inside, ready to uncover the truth, but nothing could prepare him for the shocking secrets he was about to expose. What he discovered would change everything. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. David Carter sat behind the wheel of his old sedan, staring out the windshield at the storefront of Sunrise Bakery. He had been here countless times before, but today things felt different. This was no longer the bakery he had started from the ground up. It had grown far beyond his control. As the CEO of the fastest-growing bakery chain in the country, David found himself increasingly distant from the daily operations of the business. Sunrise Bakery had expanded rapidly, with dozens of locations now scattered across the city and beyond. But with this success came a set of problems that David could no longer ignore. Troubling reports had started reaching his desk. Complaints about employee mistreatment, issues with food quality, and even rumors of stolen ingredients. At first, David brushed them off as isolated incidents. But when they continued to surface, his gut told him that something bigger was happening. He couldn't rely on the corporate reports alone. He needed to see things for himself. He had to know what was truly going on behind the scenes. With a sigh, David made a decision. He would go undercover. He would step into the very bakery that had once been his dream and observe firsthand what was happening. He had no choice but to investigate. To pull off this plan, David knew he needed to completely transform his appearance. He couldn't walk into the bakery as the CEO. No one would take him seriously. So he grew out his stubble, traded in his crisp suits for a worn-out flannel shirt, and slipped on a pair of scuffed sneakers. He even changed his posture, adopting a tired, worn-down demeanor to make himself appear like any other struggling baker looking for work. Under the alias of John Reynolds, he filled out a job application at one of his own bakery locations. It wasn't the smartest move, but it was the only way he could get close enough to see the truth. He needed to witness the bakery's operations from the ground level, far from the polished reports in boardroom meetings. David arrived at the location early in the morning. The air smelled sweet, the familiar aroma of freshly baked pastries filling his nostrils. It should have been a comforting scent, one that reminded him of the joy Sunrise Bakery had once brought to so many. But today, the smell felt different. There was a sense of tension in the air, something unsettling. As he stepped through the front door, David immediately noticed the frantic energy of the staff. Employees rushed around, their faces tense, their movements hurried. A tall man in a grease-stained apron barked orders at a young girl behind the counter. "Move faster, Mia, we don't have all day," he shouted. The girl, barely in her teens, flinched and hurried to stack the trays. David frowned. He had never approved the hiring of someone so young, especially not for such a demanding job. This wasn't the environment he had envisioned when he first founded the bakery. It was supposed to be a place of warmth, where employees were treated with respect, not where they were pushed to their limits without consideration. As David made his way further into the bakery, he was greeted by the manager, Nick Foster. Nick barely glanced at him as he wiped his hands on his apron. "Hey, you the new guy?" he asked gruffly. "Yeah," David replied, keeping his voice low. "John Reynolds. I was told to start today." Nick snorted. "All right, John. Hope you're ready to work. We don't do lazy around here." David nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had been in the business long enough to know when things didn't add up. The hurried movements of the employees, the tense atmosphere, and the coldness in Nick's voice made it clear that this wasn't just a typical busy morning. There was something deeper at play. He was quickly put to work in the back kitchen, kneading dough and preparing pastries under Nick's harsh supervision. At first, it seemed like a normal day at a bakery. Flour dusted on the counters, the hum of ovens baking fresh bread. But as David worked, he began to notice discrepancies. The ingredients being used were not the high-quality products that Sunrise Bakery was known for. Instead of the premium flour and butter that should have been in the pastries, the staff was using cheap, off-brand alternatives. The signature fillings that the bakery prided itself on had been swapped out for prepackaged, expired products. The more David observed, the more alarmed he became. This wasn't just a slip-up. It was a clear violation of the bakery's values and promises. He looked over at Mia, who was still rushing around, trying to juggle multiple tasks. She wasn't just stacking trays. She was also cleaning, restocking, and even handling cash at the register. David knew that under labor laws, no one under 16 was supposed to be working, let alone performing such demanding tasks. Mia, Nick snapped as the girl tried to carry a heavy sack of flour. Move. Faster! Without thinking, David stepped in. Hey, I've got that, he said, taking the sack from her. Mia looked up at him with a grateful expression, before quickly returning to her duties. Nick shot David a dirty look. You don't do her work, he growled. She needs to learn. But David didn't care. He wasn't here to watch a young girl be overworked and mistreated. This wasn't just about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about exploitation, and he wasn't going to stand by and let it happen. The deeper David dug into the bakery's operations, the more he saw that this was no isolated incident. Nick wasn't just a bad manager. He was actively stealing from the register and cutting corners at every turn. The food that was being served to customers was subpar, and the service was far from the friendly atmosphere David had envisioned when he founded the bakery. Customers were waiting too long for their orders, and when they complained, they were met with rudeness or indifference from the staff. David's heart sank as he realized the extent of the corruption. This was his company, his bakery, and it was being run into the ground by a man who didn't care about the employees or the product. As he continued to observe, David made a silent vow. He would uncover the full truth and take action, no matter what it took. The bakery that had once stood for quality and integrity had lost its way, and David was determined to restore it to what it was meant to be. But first he needed to dig deeper, to see just how far this corruption went. And for that he had one more move to make. The first few hours at Sunrise Bakery felt like a blur to David. Under his new identity as John Reynolds, he worked quietly, alongside the staff, blending in with the rest of the team. But the deeper he observed, the more the cracks in the operation began to show. From the moment he stepped into the back kitchen, it was clear that the bakery was not operating in the way he had intended when he first built it. There was a level of disorganization and stress that seemed to radiate through every corner of the bakery. It wasn't just the rushed atmosphere. It was the feeling of fear, the underlying tension that had settled among the staff. Nick Foster, the manager, was a large part of the problem. He ran the bakery with an iron fist, barking orders at the employees, demanding more from them than they could handle. But it wasn't just his demanding nature that was concerning. It was the way he treated the workers. His words were harsh and his behavior bordered on abusive. It was obvious that Nick had little regard for the well-being of his staff. The more David watched, the more disgusted he became. This wasn't leadership. It was intimidation. One of the young workers, Lily, was a clear target of Nick's mistreatment. Lily couldn't have been older than 15, yet she was doing the work of at least 3 people. She was juggling multiple tasks at once, stocking trays of pastries, cleaning the counters, and even managing the cash register. David couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had always made sure that his bakery followed labor laws, yet here was a young girl forced to work in dangerous conditions, doing far more than she was capable of at her age. It wasn't just unfair, it was downright illegal. Come on, Lily. Move faster, Nick snapped, his voice sharp as he watched the girl struggle with a heavy tray of pastries. She flinched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't say a word. She simply hurried to complete the task, her face flushed with exhaustion. David felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had to do something. He couldn't stand by and watch this girl be treated like this. Without thinking, he stepped forward and took the tray from her hands. Let me help you with that, he said quietly. Lily looked up at him, surprised by the offer. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and David could see the gratitude in her tired eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible, over the noise of the kitchen. Nick, however, was less than pleased. "Hey," he shouted, marching over to David. "Don't do her work. She needs to learn how to handle it." David clenched his jaw. It was clear that Nick wasn't interested in teaching the staff. He was using them as tools to get the job done. He wasn't training them to be better workers. He was exploiting them for his own benefit. And it wasn't just Lily who was suffering. David noticed that the entire staff seemed to be walking on eggshells, trying to avoid making any mistakes in front of their manager. The pressure was palpable, and it was starting to take its toll. As David continued to work in the kitchen, he began to notice other troubling signs. The ingredients being used were far below the standard that Sunrise Bakery was known for. He had built his bakery on quality, premium flour, fresh ingredients, and the finest pastries. Yet here, in the back of this bakery, the staff was using cheap off-brand products. The flour was low quality and the butter had a strange greasy texture. The signature fillings that were supposed to be made fresh every day had been replaced by prepackaged, expired alternatives. David's stomach turned as he realized the full extent of what was happening. The bakery wasn't just cutting corners, it was blatantly disregarding the very principles that had made it successful in the first place. As the day wore on, David's frustration grew. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad. He had built this business from the ground up, pouring his heart and soul into it. How had it become a place where employees were mistreated, where corners were cut, and where customers were being sold subpar products? He watched as Nick slipped behind the counter and took cash from the register, slipping it into his own pocket when he thought no one was looking. It was a small theft, but it was a theft nonetheless. David had seen enough. This was not just about bad management or a few mistakes. This was a system of exploitation and it had to stop. But David needed more proof. He couldn't confront Nick without knowing the full extent of the damage. So, he decided to push things further. He intentionally made a small mistake while preparing a batch of croissants, curious to see how Nick would react. As expected, Nick stormed over, his face turning red with anger. "What the hell is this?" Nick bellowed, pointing at the half-finished batch of pastries. "Are you an idiot? Do you know how much money you just wasted?" David stayed calm. "I can fix it," he said evenly, trying to keep his voice steady. Nick scoffed. "Fix it? You've just cost us product and time. You're lucky I don't dock your pay for this." David raised an eyebrow. "Is that how you run things here? Stealing from the register, using expired ingredients, and overworking the staff?" Nick's face drained of color, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice wavering. David smiled coldly. "Maybe you don't, but I've seen enough." Just then, Mia walked by carrying another heavy tray. David seized the moment. "Making kids do the work of 3 people. How's that part of your business model?" Nick's expression darkened and he snapped, "Mind your own business, new guy." David took a deep breath. This was it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his employee badge, the one with his real name and title. As he flipped it open, the entire kitchen staff gasped. "I'm David Carter, CEO of Sunrise Bakery." For a moment, there was silence. Nick's jaw dropped and the other employees exchanged stunned glances. Mia's eyes widened with disbelief. She had no idea that the man who had been working alongside her all day was actually the CEO of the company. David's voice was firm as he continued. "I've seen enough. You've been stealing, cutting corners, mistreating my employees, and running this bakery into the ground. And it ends today." The room was tense, but David stood tall, his decision made. It was time for a change, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way. The moment David revealed his true identity, the room seemed to freeze. Nick stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, clearly caught off guard by the revelation. The kitchen staff, who had been working in fear and silence, exchanged stunned glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. Mia, the young girl who had been enduring so much, stopped in her tracks, her tired hands still holding the tray she had been carrying. She had no idea that the man who had been working alongside her all day was the CEO of the company. I'm David Carter, CEO of Sunrise Bakery, David said calmly, his voice steady but firm. The words hung in the air, almost too heavy to process. For a moment everything was silent. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the bakery had collectively stopped breathing. Nick's expression shifted from shock to anger, his face flushing a deep shade of red. You're the CEO? He stammered, clearly trying to regain his composure. Why the hell didn't you say something earlier? David didn't flinch. Because I needed to see the truth, and what I've seen here today is enough to make my stomach turn. Nick's eyes darted around the room, trying to find a way out of the confrontation. But there was no escape. The employees, once intimidated by Nick's harsh demeanor, were now watching him with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. They had seen his abuse firsthand, but now they were witnessing something much more significant. They were finally being heard. What are you talking about? Nick spat, trying to regain control of the situation. This is how things need to be run. We have a business to keep running, and these people need to learn discipline. Discipline? David repeated, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. This isn't discipline, Nick, it's exploitation. You've been using my employees like tools, pushing them to their breaking point. You've been stealing from the register using expired ingredients and running this bakery into the ground. Nick took a step forward, his anger mounting. I don't know what you're talking about, he yelled, his face red with frustration. This is business, Carter. You can't just sit up in your office and expect everything to run smoothly without getting your hands dirty. Getting my hands dirty? David's voice grew sharper. I started this bakery with the dream of creating a place that valued quality and respect. What you've done here goes against everything this company stands for. You've taken advantage of the people who make this business successful. And that ends today. The kitchen staff was silent, but David could feel the shift. The fear that had once held them in place was slowly dissolving. Mia, who had been standing at the edge of the room, finally spoke up. Her voice, small but strong, cut through the tension. You've been treating us like slaves, Mia said, her eyes meeting David's. You've made us work long hours without respect. You've made me do things I shouldn't have to do, and you didn't care. David's heart went out to her. She was right. Mia, along with the rest of the staff, had been trapped under Nick's oppressive management for far too long. But now, they were finally standing up for themselves. They had a voice, and David was going to make sure it was heard. I know, David said softly, his voice filled with regret. And I'm sorry. You deserve so much better than this. Mia's eyes filled with tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in them too. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone truly cared about her and the others. Nick, realizing he was losing control, tried one last-ditch effort. You can't do this, he said, his voice shaky. This is my bakery. You can't just come in here and fire me. It's not your bakery anymore, David said firmly. Not the way you've been running it. You're fired, Nick. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Nick's face went pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice cracking. I've been here since the beginning. You need me. No, I don't, David replied, his tone cold and final. You've done enough damage. Now it's time for you to leave. Nick looked around desperately, searching for support. But none of the employees came to his defense. Instead, they stood tall, their heads held high. For the first time, they were united against the man who had kept them under his thumb for so long. You're fired, Nick, David repeated, his voice steady. Please pack your things and leave. Security will escort you out. The room was still for a moment, the tension palpable. Then, like a wave crashing down, the silence was broken. Nick's face twisted in fury, but there was nothing he could do. He had no power left. Without another word, he threw off his apron and stormed out of the bakery, slamming the door behind him. The kitchen erupted into cheers. The employees, who had spent years working in fear, were finally free. They hugged each other, laughing and crying in equal measure. It was a moment of victory, a moment they would never forget. David stood there watching them, a sense of relief washing over him. He had come into this bakery under disguise, unsure of what he would find. But he had found something more than he had hoped for, a group of people who, despite everything, still cared about the bakery. And now, with Nick gone, it was time to rebuild. "It's over," David said, his voice strong. "Things are going to change around here. No more mistreatment, no more cutting corners. You all deserve better and you'll get it." Mia, still wiping away tears, looked up at David. "What now?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. "Now," David said with a smile, "we start fresh. We rebuild this bakery into something we can all be proud of. And you, Mia, you've earned yourself a raise and a promotion. You've been carrying this place on your shoulders. It's time we recognize that." Mia gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Me? A promotion? You've earned it," David said warmly. "You've worked harder than anyone here and you deserve every bit of recognition." The staff cheered again, and for the first time in a long time, the bakery felt like a place of hope, a place where respect and fairness could thrive. And David, standing in the middle of it all, knew that this was only the beginning. The bakery had a long road ahead, but with a team like this, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The bakery was filled with a sense of excitement and relief that was almost palpable. The tension that had hung over the workers for so long was finally gone. Nick's departure had been a turning point, but David knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was only now starting. The employees, once afraid and demoralized, were now filled with hope. They had a new chance to rebuild not only the bakery but also their dignity. David stood in the middle of the bustling bakery, watching as his staff worked with renewed energy and enthusiasm. He couldn't help but smile. It was amazing what a little bit of respect and trust could do for a team. As he looked around, he saw people who were proud of their work again. They were no longer fearful of making mistakes or worried about being punished for things that were out of their control. Instead, they were all working together, collaborating to make Sunrise Bakery the place it was always meant to be. "How are we feeling today?" David asked, his voice carrying through the kitchen as he approached Mia, who was busy overseeing the preparation of fresh pastries. "It's amazing," Mia replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "It feels like a completely different place now. I can actually breathe here." David chuckled, nodding in agreement. "I'm glad to hear that, but we've got a lot of work to do. We need to make sure we never go back to the way things were." The bakery had a long road ahead, but David was determined to make things right. He had already implemented several changes to ensure that the business would be more transparent, fair, and focused on quality. No more cutting corners, no more using cheap ingredients, and certainly no more mistreating the staff. Everyone would be treated with respect, and every employee would have the opportunity to grow and develop their skills. He had already started by giving Maya the promotion she deserved. Not only had she been working tirelessly without recognition, but she had also been the heart of the bakery, keeping things running when everything seemed to fall apart. David offered her a managerial position, one that would allow her to help lead the team and make decisions that would shape the bakery's future. Mia, who had never imagined such an opportunity, was overwhelmed with gratitude. She had always loved working at Sunrise Bakery, but now it felt like it was truly hers. "Thank you, David," Mia said, her voice filled with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." "You've earned it, Mia," David replied, with a warm smile. "This bakery needs people like you, people who care about the work and the people behind it. I'm just glad I can finally give you the recognition you deserve." The transformation in the bakery was not only happening on the inside. David also knew that the physical space needed a major overhaul. The tired walls, outdated equipment, and worn-down furniture had all been reminders of the past. A past David wanted to leave behind. He made plans to renovate the bakery, giving it a fresh, modern look while still maintaining the charm and warmth that had always made it special. New ovens, a fresh coat of paint, and updated seating would make the space more inviting for customers and employees alike. The employees, excited by the changes, worked together to clean and organize the bakery. They painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and made sure everything was in top shape. For the first time in a long time, They felt like they were truly contributing to something bigger than themselves. The bakery was no longer just a place where they worked. It was a place where they could all be proud to be a part of. As the renovations continued, David spent more time with the employees, getting to know them on a personal level. He listened to their concerns, asked for their ideas, and made sure they felt heard. He knew that rebuilding the bakery wasn't just about fixing the physical space. It was about rebuilding trust and morale. He had to prove to them that they mattered, that they were valued, and that their voices were important. Over the next few weeks, the bakery continued to thrive. The staff, now united and empowered, took pride in their work. They followed the new guidelines, ensuring that every ingredient was fresh, every pastry was made with care, and every customer was treated with respect. Word spread quickly about the changes at Sunrise Bakery, and more customers began to flock to the store, eager to experience the new atmosphere. The bakery was no longer just another chain. It had become a place that people wanted to support. David could see the difference in his staff, and he knew that he had made the right decision by taking action. He had come into this bakery undercover, expecting to find a few small issues to fix. What he had found, however, was something much bigger, a system of mistreatment and corruption that had been holding his team back. By confronting the problems head-on, he had not only saved the bakery but also given his employees a chance at a better life. They now had the opportunity to build something that they could all be proud of. One afternoon, as the bakery buzzed with activity, David took a moment to step back and appreciate how far they had come. The employees were laughing and talking as they worked. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and customers smiled as they walked out with their pastries. Everything was starting to feel right again. As he stood there, David thought about how much he had learned from this experience. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about controlling people or demanding results. It was about empowering them, trusting them, and standing up for what was right. He had learned that taking action, even when it was difficult, could change lives and create a better future for everyone involved. As the sun set and the last customers left the bakery, David looked around one last time. He felt a sense of pride wash over him. Sunrise Bakery was no longer a place of fear and exploitation. It was a place of hope, respect, and opportunity. And this was just the beginning. "We've come a long way," David said, a smile on his face. "But this is just the start. Let's make sure we never forget what we've built here." The employees cheered, their faces glowing with excitement and pride. David knew they were ready for whatever came next. They had rebuilt the bakery, and now they were ready to build a future together, one that was stronger, kinder, and full of promise.